One of the advantages of New Hampshire is that our public school standards were adopted with high school competencies. So that pretty much got the ball rolling. So from a district perspective, we waited a little bit of time, but we really focused on getting our school board structures in place. So for example, having the conversations at the school board level about the minimum standards, adopting policy, especially in the area of curriculum, so that those structures in place so that when we move forward, it was basically a school district policy at that point. We started encompassing competencies in our annual goals. So the school district basically had that in place. And I think one of the smartest things that we did was we kind of incorporated all of these new ideas, if you will, in our accreditation process for high school. So that we interwove a lot of the minimum standards, the new thinking, if you will, in with the accreditation process. So we're all really working toward our accreditation. So our goals, our policies, all of that kind of made sense when it was all integrated. We also started by having conversation in my office, quite frankly, with some administrators about an understanding of what a competency was. At that time, we didn't have a lot of information, if you will, from the state level. So it was really a local level decision on how we proceeded. So there was a lot of conversations about what is a competency. We reviewed all the state standards. And in some cases, we went beyond the state standards because, quite frankly, there were other things going on in the nation that we thought were better, if you will. So we started looking at, we were looking at, math standards outside of the state. We were also looked at the next generation science standards, which were outside of the state. But what we really began with the conversations is, what is the essence of a competency? What are we really striving for? And what we ended up with was, what are the big ideas that you learn in a particular content area that you take away and you never forget? You never forget those things. For example, in world language, you may not be able to speak the language, but you walk away with an understanding of the country's culture. Those kinds of things. Like science, you may not remember, a particular process or whatever, but you do understand that there is a relationship between structure and function. And what we found out is competencies were really all of the stuff that was at the front of the standards. So when basically you started looking at standards, the tendency is to kind of jump into your grade level and look at, what do I have to do at my grade level? Competencies aren't really about that. Competencies were really about the understanding of the content. What is, the nature of the content area. One of the other things that we struggled with regard to competency adoption, because at that time it was left up to individual school districts, is what do we do from grade level to grade level and school to school? One thing that we did, which was very different at the time from other districts, is we decided to approach it K-12, because science really doesn't, the competencies, in our opinion, didn't really change from grade level to grade level. They were still the big ideas you still carried away from you. So at kindergarten, your understanding of structure and function is obviously very different than basically a 12th grader. So we ended up basically adopting our competencies K-12. And I think that was probably one of the best things we ended up doing, because several years later, the New Hampshire standards were changed to basically graduation competencies, and we were sitting there going, yes, ours are already in place. So I think some of the biggest challenges were trying to understand what a competency is and how to implement that in the regular classroom. The other challenges and hurdles is parent understanding of what competencies are, and beyond that understanding also came the ramifications of not being competent as a student, especially with the grading and reporting system. So you're well into your competency adoption, and then you go and try to report it, and that's when basically it kind of hits the fan. So those are some of our biggest challenges and hurdles. The other, just to add on to that, is we weren't the first ones out of the gate with regard to this. We weren't in the middle, we were kind of toward the front. Because of that, I think we had more challenges and hurdles than other districts that are presently going through it right now. A piece of advice on how to tackle this is really to put the work up front. To have those conversations about what does a competency mean within the content area. The other is to involve teachers throughout the process. We develop competencies again by looking at the standards and focusing on what the big ideas, the concepts and skills that need to be transferred. Those competencies were put in place, and then they were basically distributed to content teachers who then looked at them, tweaked them, or basically said, hey, they look great, or maybe we should think about this. And I'll tell you, they probably went through up to 10 revisions at that point. So including your teachers up front early. The reporting and grading, I think another piece of advice is when you're developing a competency system, there are some districts that had competencies, 12, 15 competencies. And one of the things by including our teachers in the conversation is, and rightfully so, they said, well, how do we keep track of all this? So there is that implementation that you really need to consider. And by talking to our teachers early on, it was like, sure, we can probably track 5, maybe 8 competencies. And then the other piece is, well, what happens when it's grade to grade, especially in high school? We've got 9th graders, we got 11th graders, what do we do then? And that was a piece where we decided really to do the same competencies district-wide. So I think the advice is to include teachers early, have as many conversations as you can. As far as parents, I mean, get the communication out there. I don't have, the magic, formula for that one, but you try to have those kinds of conversations as best you can. I would recommend, if we had to do it over again, that we really had those kinds of forums with parents. But I think those conversations are fine. What really happens is it really comes down to the grading and reporting. And there were many, many conversations about that. And at one point, we had many parents show up at a school board meeting about that. When you go down this road, don't go down it unless you truly believe in it. Because there are going to be times when you're going to have, some very vocal people come out and basically say, no, we don't want this anymore, get rid of it, whatever. And you truly have to believe that competencies are the way to go. I know that going through school myself, a lot of times you forget the minutia, if you will, of a content area. And once that is gone, what do you have left of the particular content area? So, when we talk about structure and function, or in social studies we talk about cooperation or whatever, those are things that translate from content areas to within their content area, and quite frankly to life itself. So if we're really talking about preparing kids for college, life, and career, that's what you're preparing them for, is those big competencies. ELA, reading, writing, speaking, listening, research, inquiry. I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than that. And I think that that's the purpose of public education, is really to provide those big idea skills that kids take away with them to wherever they decide to go with life. I think that when we looked at it, we did look at Common Core. At that time, we had New Hampshire standards that were not Common Core. Really, you have to look at everything that's out there and say, this really makes sense. Maybe what you have in place for a state standard doesn't quite fit what you're doing, and maybe there's another set of standards out there that does make sense. And we were very lucky, because what we ended up doing is we adopted the math practices for our competencies, problem solving, perseverance. And it ended up all of those were, those were out of the national math standards. They ended up being the Common Core standards. ELA, we kind of took a different route, and reading, writing, speaking, listening were incorporated in our competencies. But then we looked at the Smarter Balance. They were using those as for their assessment. We said that's what we're really talking about. So when you looked at competencies for our district, what we ended up doing is we separated out our content areas. We really looked at math and ELA very different than social studies, science, and unified arts. For social studies, science, and unified arts, we looked at competencies more as concepts and skills. So like I said before, science, a big concept in science is structure and function, the change, those kinds of things. When we looked at math and ELA, we more looked at practices. What is the practices that a student needs to have to be a good mathematician, a literate student? So when you look at that, we looked at problem solving as a very important skill that a student had to have for mathematics. You must be reading in ELA. So we really looked at it very different, and we did that more skills or practices based than we did the concept based for unified arts, social studies, and science. Another piece of advice is you do what works for your district and your kids and your staff. So you really have to look at where your community is, knowing that you have to go to the competency base, but I think you need to be smart about it, take time, and like I said, have those conversations, have those various different iterations of things, and make it work for your particular school district.
Well, actually, I was a freshman when I was first introduced to the idea, and hearing words like summative and formative was weird because it was something that I've never thought about before. And so as a freshman, coming from having 90s and 80s and Fs and stuff, it was weird changing into my sophomore year with Ns because I felt like I was taking a step back into elementary school with different letter grades. But as the year went on, I started to realize that it actually made sense because instead of focusing so much on the little things that I should take my own responsibility for, it was really putting a focus on everything that I was interpreting into a bigger assessment, like a test. Because if I don't do the formatives, then I'm basically going to fail the test because I'm not preparing myself enough. So the competency-based learning and grading is smart because it teaches the kids that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then your responsibility is not living up to what you're supposed to, and you're not going to end up being successful. And I think that people don't realize that it's going to help you later in life because it's showing you the little things do add up, and those little things could make you pass or fail, which you don't realize. The new report card's kind of confusing at first because you get it and it looks like a novel, but you look through it, and if you know what you're looking at, then you'll see how the person interacts in class and how they interact with the teacher and their peers and how much work they actually complete. But in order to understand the report card, you have to do the research on your own, and you have to be able to read through the directions, which people are lazy to do, so then people complain. But if you follow directions and you do what it says to understand, then you'll understand that it shows how the person's interacting at school, and that based on what they're doing and if they're doing their formatives or not, and they're completing their summatives on time and getting good grades on that, then you'll see that it accurately shows how well someone is in the classroom. The reassessment process just changed this year. Before, it was really confusing because, like you said, every teacher had different ways of reassessing, and so some teachers would have a certain day they had to be done, and other teachers were like, hey, if the quarter's not over, you can still reassess the test from the first day of school. And when this grading system first came into effect, people were reassessing tests that were from quarter one when it was like the end of the entire year. So it's like June and people are reassessing the test from October, which doesn't make any sense. So since then, the school has changed the policy and like formed it to something else, which is something better. And this year, it makes a lot more sense because it's like if you fail a test or you get below like an 85, you can reassess it, but the highest you can get is an 85. So,
the first time I heard about it was the end of freshman year because we were told we were going to transition to competency-based grading in sophomore year, and I was actually pretty excited about it. For one thing, it meant no more finals or midterms, but it also seemed like a more fair way to determine people's intelligence and how to help them succeed at school. Because I tend to do less formatives now because I know they're only 10%, but because I know summatives are so important, I will study for those and I'll do the formatives necessary for the summatives. And I guess now I just focus more on the summatives and the formatives that I need to understand the summative than every single formative. But it's also helped me save time for other classes and activities. I think the idea of reassessment is fantastic. You allow kids to relearn what they didn't know and prove that they do know it the second time around. And it's helpful because you help them along the whole way. But it would work perfectly in an ideal world, but there's just too many opportunities for kids to abuse the system, really. They'll take a look at the test without an intention of passing the first time and just get a look at it and say, oh, well, I can do this or I can study on this, and then they'll just take a similar test the next time and ace it. There are kids who are passing with very good grades, 85s, 90s, and they're constantly reassessing to try to boost their grade above others. And I like I said, I think it's a very good idea, but it definitely needs to be worked on. I really actually do like the report card. That's probably my favorite part, is because you have a page dedicated for each subject, and you can really see in 4 to 6 different competencies what you're best at in the subject, besides just an overall grade. So you can tell what you need to work on to bring up your grade, or what your strengths are in each section. I think it's worth it to start early, because I think the system will definitely work over time. It just really needs to be worked and new things added. But it's a good idea, so I think it'll work in the long run.
From what I understand, the students are required to pass each competency in their class that they're taking. There may be several competencies in one class, and they get separate grades for each competency as well as the class grade. So in order to pass a class, you need to pass all the competencies. That's my understanding of how it works. Well, I was not a fan of it at first, but it has helped my particular child when they have done bad on a certain part of the test. They have had the opportunity to reassess that test, and it has brought their grade up. So I do think it's a positive. It gives kids a chance, if they do have a bad test every once in a while, to bring their grade up to where they are capable of being. However, in a certain sense, it gives kids a false sense of security. They may not try as hard the first time if they know that they can just reassess it again if they do bad. And it's kind of, not everything's a do-over, and that kind of gives them a false sense of security that they can just do things over all the time. So that would be negative. Well, when I first heard of it, it was new to the school, and I think they were also learning how to explain it to the parents and the students, and there was a lot of controversy because it was a new system. Once it got underway and people began to see how it worked, more questions came, and the school at that point did do an adequate job in trying to address the questions that the parents had. I believe the biggest challenge is to teach your child you still have to try to do your best the first time around. As I said earlier, it kind of makes some kids get into the habit of not really worrying how they're going to do the first time. They know they can always do it again. One thing that they did change that I think improved that was if you reassess the first time, you cannot start at 100% on a test, and I do think that was a big improvement to the system, and I think that makes it fair for all the students across the board. For those that have reassessed and those that have already done well the first time around, they should be awarded for that. So I think that that is an improvement on it, and I think that was a challenge when it first started. And I think now the way it's based, that you cannot start at the top, gives you a better sense of where you really fall in the system, and that, you know, doing right the first time is still the best way to get the best grade. They're probably going to get, I would think, some negative feedback in the beginning. It's hard to change, and the way a lot of the parents grew up, it's totally different than what we have always known and what we were always told. You do things right the first time, and that's it. You don't get a redo. So that comes with a lot of negativity from people. I think once they realize exactly what the program is about and the benefits that the kids can get from it, I think it will be accepted. It takes a little time, and you know, you hit some bumps along the way, but once you get all the information out there and more questions get answered, people become more comfortable with the way it works. And I do think that now I understand it a little better. You know, there's always pros and cons with everything, but I do think it is a working system if you use it to your advantage the way it should be used.